Hello and welcome back to my video. This is a Dream Dsmp family reunion George XYN by Instrumental Break on Wattpad. Anyways, let's get on to the story. George. After an hour-long drive of preparing George for his event, complete with a flower cart of my extended family and information on every person I knew, he pulled into the parking lot of my yearly family reunion. Truth be told, I was terrified. My extended family already was full of judgy people who criticized everything I did, and now they were begging me to bring George so they could meet him. That we had been dating for a few months now, and he's obviously one of the sweetest people in life. But I wasn't sure I was ready to subject him to what he was about to witness. I had been going to these things since I was a baby and hated it more and more every year. If it were up to me, I would have stopped going as soon as I turned 18, but my parents begged me every year. I was too nice to say no, so here we were. I looked over at George, who was reading through the flower card of my family one last time. I smiled slightly, even though I had wished I didn't have to bring him. He was clearly putting a lot of effort into this, and it was really sweet. Okay, he said, shoving the paper into the glove box below him. He turned to me with a proud grin. I think I'm ready. I sighed, closing my eyes and mentally preparing myself to get out and talk to them. I felt him grab my hand and squeeze it gently. It's going to be okay, he said to me when I looked at him, and I felt a little better. We got out of my car and headed over to the old pavilion in front of us, where my family was mingling. The first family member spot us was my cousin Marla. He was one of the few people I actually got along with. She was a music teacher in the South who was one of the only relatives who wasn't super judgy, and helped. We were only like 6 years apart in age. Hey, YN, it's so good to see you. She jogged over to me and gave me a big hug, almost suffocating me. Hey, Marla, it's so good to see you too, I said after we pulled apart. And this must be, she thought for a moment, turned to George. George, I've heard so much about you, she said, shaking his hand. Yeah, that's me. I hope it's all good things, he said jokingly, but she just nodded. She turned to me. I know you're nervous to talk to everyone. I've done my best to talk your boyfriend up as much as I can, especially since he's the first you've brought here. I nodded, feeling my cheeks heat up as George looked at me with an amused smile. I have to go get my hubby a beer while he plays frisbee out back. So I'll see you guys later, she said, heading over to the food table and waving goodbye. I turned back to George, who was still smiling. First boyfriend here, eh? He said playfully, elbowing me. I rolled my eyes. Don't flatter yourself too much. We've only just started, I chuckled, taking his hand in hand into battle. Everything went pretty much how I expected it to go. My relatives being friendly to my face, but shooting condescending looks and whispering as soon as we turned away. I tried to not let it bother me, and George didn't even seem to notice much. So we continued talking to people. Finally, we came across the last group of relatives we hadn't talked to yet tonight. Unfortunately, it was also the most hard to please group of people in the whole family. My grandfather and my aunt and uncle. My grandfather was a war vet in his 90s, somehow still kicking it, and my uncle was his son, my mom's brother. My grandfather was a kind of judgmental that wasn't doubly judgmental. Rather, he would tell you straight up that he didn't like something. That scared me because he had never approved of any of He never approved of any of the younger generation's significant others. I really didn't want him to be rude to George. Ah, there's my favorite grandchild, he said, and greeted me with a smile and a hug. I smiled and gave him a hug, then greeted my aunt and uncle by his side. Hey, Grandpa, how's it going? I asked, and he sighed. Ah, same old aches and pains. Now, who is this young man? I nodded to George. My grandfather believed you should introduce yourself in a conversation if you were over the age of 13. If not, you were still a child. Hi, I'm George. I'm Ryan's boyfriend, George said, trying to seem confident while they awkwardly shook hands. My grandfather stood up, seamlessly sizing him up. It wasn't very intimidating, considering George was 5'9" and my grandfather was 5'4". George, huh? He said, observing him. Now, Dad, let's be nice, okay? My uncle said, letting my grandfather back down. My heart sank as I saw that familiar look in my grandfather's eyes, the disapproval, disappointment. It's not like I cared all that much. I didn't need anyone's approval for my own relationship, but I was so afraid that George would take it too hard or that he would say something hurtful to George. We stood in silence as my grandfather continued to process what he was saying. George greeted my aunt and uncle politely while I waited in agony. My grandfather looked at me in the eye, and he must have seen how nervous I was. His expression softened and he smiled. I knew a George once. He was a good man. George and I exchanged glances, both surprised before looking back at my grandfather. Oh, really? He asked, and my grandfather nodded. He went on about a story of a man he had known in high school while we listened. But I wasn't really paying attention. I was sort of relieved that I wanted to dance, but I held back for the sake of not embarrassing myself. My grandfather mumbled after he finished his story. I could use a drink. George, you're a strong young lad. Do you mind grabbing me some lunch for the food table? George glanced at me and nodded, heading to the other side of the pavilion. My grandfather waved me over so I would sit next to him, and I obliged. And I whatever. This fellow, he seems like a good man. Make sure he treats you well, he said, patting my hand. I smiled. Thanks, Grandpa, and looked over at George, who was pouring a glass of punch for my grandfather, and smiled. I know he will. Later that afternoon, after we ate some lunch and finished visiting with relatives, we sat next to each other on an old hammock behind the pavilion while a group of kids played kickball. Well, that went well, George smiled, taking my hand gently and squeezing it. I sighed to return his smile. I'm glad it did. I was worried. He laughed. Why? 'Cause I'm such an awful person? I rolled my eyes, punching him in the shoulder. Stop it. You know that's not why. I shouldn't have even questioned it. You're such a nice guy. I can't imagine them not liking you. I yawned, exhausted from being so stretched and run from table to table. He lay back in the hammock and gently pulled me down with him, laying my head on his chest while he wrapped his arms around me. Thank you, I said, feeling my eyes again heavy, for coming with me, of course. I felt myself drifting, enjoying being wrapped in his arms and listened to his soft breathing and the warm sun on us, and eventually fell asleep. George's POV. I stared at the sky as she drifted to sleep, smiling to myself. I knew she had been so worried about today, but it was good to see her finally relax, and it was always nice to just hold her. I kept one foot on the ground, gently rocking the hammock so she'd stay asleep, turned my head back towards the pavilion. I saw grandfather being walked back to his car, clearly getting ready to go home. He happened to turn around and spot me, and I tensed up a bit. He looked at me for a moment and saw her sleeping next to me, and he smiled. He nodded to me, got in the car, and drove off. I turned back to Lyanne, watching her sleep peacefully. I laid my head back and smiled once again. It was a good day. This is the end of the story, and I hope you like it. Remember, this is by Instrumental Break on Wattpad, and I really hope you like it. Tomorrow, I would maybe do 2 or another update. Anyways, I'll see you guys later. Bye.